I would say use a small brush for this. And take some white, maybe go along the edge there, do some strokes, just some loose, fun, whimsical brush strokes. Today, I would like to show you how to paint a beautiful, yummy, luscious lemon cake in the style of Wayne Thiebaud. Now, stick around and paint with me. My name is Tabitha, and I'm a teaching artist, and I love to help people learn to express themselves with paint. If you don't know Wayne Thiebaud, you should check out his work. He painted the most amazing, beautiful, luscious desserts. So I really enjoyed creating this video, figuring out how to break his cake down into shapes, to simplify it, to show you how you can sketch it out and paint it. And also, I really loved playing with the color and the dynamics that he would get in his paintings. They're just so bright and beautiful. So this is your expression. We are working from Wayne Thiebaud's lemon cake painting, and we are creating our own version of it. We're not trying to duplicate his painting. We are studying it. And if at any point you feel like putting something else in there or doing something slightly differently, do it. And also, there's not a right way or a wrong way to paint. And if you get a better result by doing something different than I suggest, do it. So the way I suggest you watch this video, if you're going to paint along, one, you could watch it all the way through just to sort of get the lay of the land. And then when you're ready to start painting, start it over again and pause it when you need to. The teaching part of the video is less than an hour. If I were teaching this in person, I would take at least 2 hours with the class. And painting it for myself to get the results I want, it would take much longer than 2 hours. So take your time with this. Don't feel like you have to get it done in the time of the video, because you probably could not. Because I speed up the painting in some places. Take as long as you need with it, but my suggestion is to not stop the video, move on with your life, and come back a month later. Keep the momentum up. Keep painting through it. And it's an experiment, just like all art is an experiment, you know, and when you work off of a master painting, it helps you to sort of understand. You get curious and creative and try and figure out how they did that painting, how they got those results. I don't know how he did it, frankly, but I tried in my own ways. I experimented, and I think I did a pretty good job. So let me know what you think. Let's talk about supplies. So the colors that I suggest for you to use are not the colors you have to use. Like if you have different colors, if you don't have these colors, if it's slightly different, give it a try and see what happens. I will put these colors down in the description also. So I used a Cerulean Blue, an Ultramarine Blue, Naples Yellow. Now I'm going to say this is probably the most important one to get exact. And I say it in the video, but Naples Yellow is fairly opaque, and most yellows are very translucent. So you can really see through yellows, and it's hard to put acrylic yellows on top of other colors because you'll be able to see through. So if you go yellow on top of blue, it'll turn green, for instance. So if you don't have Naples Yellow and you don't have time to get it and you just want to get painting, you can substitute by either painting white first and then painting your yellow over the white, because the white should cover whatever's in the background. Or experiment with mixing your white with some yellow and see if that covers. Always experiment, you never know what you're gonna find. Also used magenta. I think I used a regular magenta. This is a quinacridone, which is now my favorite. Back then I was just using regular old magenta, but quinacridone is the best. And of course white. Always white, big tube of white. I also used a paint retarder, and I will put that in the comments. So you mix it with your paint and it extends the open time, meaning that it doesn't dry, your paints don't dry as quickly, so you have time to work with them. They stay open. You can work and blend and smudge, which is helpful for this painting, but not necessary. As for brushes, use what works for you. So I used a couple different sizes of filberts and flats, and I used an angle brush, a smaller one than this, but that really is good for getting crisp, clean lines, straight lines, especially if it's new like this one, and flat. And I also used a canvas panel, 9x12 canvas panel like this. Use whatever you want. All right, have fun, Let me know if you have questions or if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. All right, have fun. So tonight we are going to paint our own version of Wayne Thiebaud's lemon cake. So here's the original that I printed out. The goal here is not to duplicate his painting, but it's to try some different techniques and see what he might have done to get this painting. There's no right or wrong way to approach a painting, but we're going to experiment a little bit and we'll come away with our own versions of it. So here's mine. I could certainly do a few more things to it, actually, to finish it. It looks like it's a little unfinished, but that's okay. And we're going to start with the background. So I'm going to squeeze out some Cerulean Blue and some white, and there is a big old glare on my palette. There we go. I'm going to use a palette knife to do a little bit of mixing on my palette. Now I want to keep some of this cerulean pure blue and some of the white pure white. So I'm just going to scooch some of the white over and then wipe this off on my towel here. And then I'm going to take a little bit of this blue and start mixing it into this white. Now when you're doing mixing, always mix in small batches unless you really know what you're doing. And start with just a little bit of that darker color if you're going for a light value. And looking at my painting here, I think that's a little bit lighter than I'd like. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of that blue. Now you can mix with a brush if you don't have a palette knife. Sometimes it's better to mix with a palette knife especially if you want just a solid color. Usually when I paint, I like to be pretty blendy on the canvas, but for this, since I'm painting someone else's work, attempting to paint it, I'm going to try and be precise. Now, of course, for your painting, if you don't feel like following exactly, that's totally fine. If you want a purple background, go for it. All right, so I'm going to use my big filbert brush here, which is a little bit wet, and I wiped it off on my towel. And I'm going to say that background, the top, that darker blue goes about 1/4 of the way down. So I'm just doing these horizontal brush strokes, just back and forth. And I'm just going to estimate. I'm going to eyeball what I think 1/4 of the way down is. And I'm going to try and keep that line pretty straight. Now while that paint is still wet, and you might not happen to have this handy, but I've got a perforated edge here on an old card, and he had these stripy marks through. So I'm just going to pull this right across. And you can even buy tools in the store to do that, but it's kind of nice to recycle things. And I don't know how well you can even see that, but there are some nice stripy lines in there. Okay, now I'm not even going to clean off my brush. I'm just going to go straight into this Cerulean Blue and do the bottom 2/3 in cerulean. Now I'm trying to get a nice thin coat here because we have this whole cake to go, and although it's a pretty textured painting, I don't want like a straight line cutting right through this cake. So if you paint thin, that won't happen. So Wayne Thiebaud, I believe is how you pronounce his name, really interesting painter in my opinion, because there's something so crisp and precise about his lines, and yet they are, he was a very painterly painter, meaning you can see brush strokes. He leaves brush strokes behind. You can tell it's a painting. And I love that. So this painting is very high contrast, and it's perfect for studying color values. And value, of course, is the lightness or darkness of a color. So I'm not worrying too much about the brush strokes here, or what direction they're going in, or if you can even see some canvas behind, because this is just the first layer. So I'm just going to let that dry as is. I'm going to wipe off my brush and set it in my water so that it doesn't dry out, and wait for that to dry. And while you're waiting for paint to dry, this is a good opportunity to find something to draw with, if you have something to draw with. You could probably do it in pencil. I'm not going to recommend that. If you've got a piece of Conti crayon or compressed charcoal or charcoal pencil like this, these are all great to draw with. And if you don't, that's okay. And you don't even have to draw if you don't want. I kind of like to draw on the canvas sometimes when I might want to move my lines around. But you could certainly go in with a small brush and a little bit of white paint and sketch out your painting. That's totally fine. So I'm actually going to blow dry. So I'm a very fast painter. So if you're still, you know, painting at this point, don't worry about it. Take your time. You can just pause this video and come back to it. All right, so I'm going to move on to the drawing portion. And now I just folded this image in half, and the middle of the cake is not quite halfway through. Of course, yours doesn't have to be just like this. I'm just trying to get it as close as possible for the demo purpose here. So notice that this line right here is just above where that slice of cake is taken out. So look at this form, this shape that's made just on the top of the canvas there in that top quarter. That's the shape we're after. So I'm using what is it, 12 by 9 canvas, and I'm going to kind of measure this with my hands. It's a little hard to measure this way, but it's about 9 fingers for me. 9 fingers wide, if that helps anybody. But I'm just going to mark it off here and on each side. So actually, it's that big on mine. Yeah, that's about right. So it's going to come a couple of fingers up. I'm going to make that mark there, and then just angle it over. And I'm going to try and draw darker so you can see that. Now it's going to come straight down on either edge, and we're going to end up a couple fingers from the bottom here. Now I like using this charcoal because I can paint right over it. It will blend into the paint. And if I make a mistake, if I don't want to get rid of something, I can just smudge it right out. Okay, now this part. This, if it followed through, is an oval shape. So I'm just going to try and paint in an oval, and it shows me that I'm a little off right here. It could be a little more rounded. And don't worry if you don't get it just right. We can adjust it with the paint, but get it as right as you can, if that makes any sense. So try not to make it look like a football. It's really quite rounded on the sides here. All right. That cake, that side of the cake is about 2 fingers wide for me. So I'm going to pull this line down. And that's a little less than 2 fingers wide. So you have to find ways when you're copying something or being inspired by it, even if it's just nature or a portrait, anything. You sort of have to find ways to measure, you know, and you see a lot of artists, you know, measuring with their paintbrush like this. And that's definitely helpful. As a matter of fact. Now it helps, I'm at an angle here, so it's a little hard for me to see, but I think that's about right. And you have to remember which measurement that is. So that's this one right here. Now the bottom part's going to come up at roughly the same angle as the top. And it's not a, you know, straight cylinder. This is actually a very soft line. If you look at that edge, it's very soft. We don't see a very crisp bottom to that cake. This one is a little bit more crisp. So let's see. So what I'm doing is I'm putting my pencil up to the cake, and with my thumb I'm measuring where I think that bottom line is going to be, and then I'm bringing it over to my painting and making a mark there. And like I said, since I'm at an angle, this might be a little bit wonky. If you're painting on an easel where it's more straight up and down, you'll have an easier time with that. That's it. This is at this point sort of looking like an old-fashioned hat box a little bit. Now the top of these 2 lines and this line is not going to be there. So the point of this slice, which is really where the middle of the cake about is, it's a little bit below that line. And then look at the angle. Look at the angle and eyeball it to see. Actually, you don't even need to eyeball it because we already have these edges, so it's going all the way out to that edge. And then the middle of the cake's going to come straight down to, well, let's see. Out there. So about 4 fingers wide. 4 of my fingers anyway. And then once again, we just connect the lines. So there's so many ways that you could go about doing something like this. Like, for instance, you could have started with the void, which is like a book, right? It looks like an open book. And then brought it around. Of course, this is very sloppy. But that would be another way to approach it. So do whatever makes sense to you. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch a little line where this shadow is. So the light's coming from this side and casting a shadow right there. So that comes a little bit out, maybe a pinky width out. And it goes, actually in the original it goes not all the way to the corner of the cake. And that's a pretty straight line. That is some very direct light. So look at the shape that this triangle makes, and then look at the shape that your triangle makes. How close is it? Doesn't have to be exact, but let's try to make it as close as we can. So you can pause now if you're still working on the drawing and just keep this screen up. I'm going to move on to painting in the background. And yes, we have already painted in the background, but now I'm going to paint in this white. And what I'm going to try and do is leave this shadow and this shadow. So actually, I think the best bet is to sketch it in. So we have that shadow already. So this one, go from this one. See how that goes up at that angle and curves around? And it comes a little bit higher than that slice, right? Than the front of the cake. So I'm going to start it here. And it's starting at the very bottom of this side of the cake, and it's looping around. Almost looks like a cup handle, the shape of a mug handle. I don't think that's bad. I'm going to go ahead and leave that shadow shape alone. And the next thing I'm going to do is paint over this blue with white. Now, you may wonder why we just didn't paint white first or leave the white canvas. And it's because I want this blue to sort of show through. Now, in his painting, of course, this is a printout. We don't know what the original looked like exactly, but it's not just white. There's other colors in there. So I'm just going to take this white, not the light blue, and I'm going to paint right around the cake. And don't worry if you don't get it all covered. This might, we might do another layer over it later. This painting, we're just working in layers, which is appropriate since it's a layer cake. So now be careful when you get here, you don't cover that shadow. We want that shadow to show. Oops. And if you cover it up, don't worry about it. We'll go back and paint it back in. So if your paint starts getting a little dry, if you dip it in water, dip your brush in water, don't stir it around, just dip it a tiny bit, you can go back to working with the paint that you have on the canvas, and it will just reactivate it and revitalize it and spread it around a bit. So I'm going right up to that edge. We're going to paint another color over that line later. And don't worry about getting it perfect. One, there is no perfect, but two, look at how smudgy things are. It's very light and whimsical and smudgy. Somehow things look crisp, but they're not. All right, so once you've got a coat on there, let's leave it be. Even if some blue is still showing through, that's okay. And you may decide to leave it that way. I like it because it's very, again, it's very painterly. I like those brush strokes showing. All right, so I'm wiping off my brush on my towel before I put it in my water to give it a rinse. Try and get as much paint off before it hits the water. That way it keeps my water a little cleaner. Okay, so here's where we're going to start using this retarder if you have it. So I'm pulling out Naples Yellow. Now, if you don't have Naples Yellow, you're going to want to mix your yellow with white or paint white first on the cake. You'll have to see how it goes, because most yellows are not going to cover this blue. But Naples will, because it's very opaque. It's, as far as I know, the only opaque yellow. So I've got a blob of yellow paint, and I'm going to do a drop, a nice decent sized drop, maybe 2, of the retarder. And then I'm going to find my palette knife. I'm going to mix it up. So make sure you mix it really well. You can use the tip of the palette knife to stir it around and the edge of the palette knife to scrape it and fold it over. Once it's mixed in, I'm just going to take my brush and get the paint off of the edge of the knife and start painting. Now don't go over this too much. Get a nice bit of yellow and leave it there, because if you keep going, you're going to end up pulling the yellow up and then you'll be able to see the blue. So paint lightly, don't use a lot of pressure. If you use a lot of pressure, you're going to push down too hard and squeeze the paint off, and then you'll be able to see the blue. Just follow those curves of the cake around. You can paint thick here, you can leave a bunch of paint behind. Pretend you're frosting the cake. And if there's a little bit of blue here and there showing through, don't worry about it right now. We're going to go back over with another layer. And I'm stopping with the top of the cake for the moment. And now I'm going to pull out my magenta. Whoops, squeeze a little there. Do the same thing with the retarder. Nice gooey drop, and mix it up. Now you probably need a lot less magenta than this and a lot more yellow than that. And now I'm just going to pick up a little magenta with the yellow. So see that edge and how there's some magenta on that edge and it's sort of dripping down, but that magenta is heavily mixed with the yellow. So you want just a tiny bit of that magenta on there and a bunch of yellow. And this brush is probably too big. You might want to switch to a smaller brush. Since I already have paint on it, I'm not going to switch. So at the moment, I'm not worrying about the variations in color. The magenta here, the yellow there. I'm just trying to get a layer on here. And cover all the blue. And again, smaller brush would be much easier. Same thing with this side, except I'm going to go a little more magenta on this side, because that's in the shadow. All right, I'm going to get rid of this brush for the moment because that brush was way too big. And I've got this little square brush, which is going to do good to get in these little areas that I missed. So this chalk line that I did, I want to cover, but I really don't want to go too far over it. Now, at this point, you might start seeing things that look a little off with your drawing, and you can certainly adjust that with your paint. And when I get to the edge here, I want to sort of blend it in. So I've sort of lost my edge, so I'm going to come back up here and see how high that dark goes up there, almost to the, I'm going to call that the horizon line there. I think that added something. And since I used the retarder, the yellow is still wet. So I can blend it in. Don't worry if that edge doesn't look just the way you want it to look. We're going to go back over it later. I'm going to take a little bit of this magenta and a little bit of this yellow now and do this, outline this top edge and side. Whoops, that's a lot of magenta. But I'm not going to wipe it off. I'm just going to grab some more yellow and go over it because it's really blendy. So this is a great brush for this because it's about as wide as I want that line to be. So if you have a small flat brush, it's great for this. This is going to turn right down, turn that corner, head down. And we'll touch up the colors later, don't worry about it. I'm mainly trying to get the structure in here. And I'm going to go along the bottom here. And get that center line. Now we might end up covering up some of this when we paint in the actual cake, the inside of the cake, but that's okay. This will help us see where we're going with this whole thing. And the last thing I'm going to do for this step is to paint in these cream filling lines. And I'm just going to eyeball it. They're pretty much even. And like I said, we'll probably paint right over these and come back and put them in again. But it's good to have a target to know where we're going. And knowing that I'm going to paint these in again makes me not worry so much about where I'm putting these lines. Because I know I can adjust it. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. And I just noticed that I think my cake should be rounder up here. Ah, there we go. Looks like an ocean cake. Okay, that's it for this step. So if you're still working on outlining or whatever you're working on, go ahead and pause it. And I'm going to move on to the next step. So the next step is going to be filling in this cake. Now notice we have some of it is in shadow and some of it is in light. And the light cake is not exactly white, but it's not exactly yellow either. And the shadow side is not yellow. That's blue and drippy. So I'm going to switch to a medium brush, something that I can get in here easily with. So a square brush works great, flat brush. There's no retarder in this white, so I'm going to go ahead and mix a little bit in there. And now I'm going to take some white and some yellow, more white than yellow, and start coloring these cake layers in. Now, if this is too hard to stay within these lines, you can go ahead and just paint over the layers that you just painted. I'm going to work within them though, because there might be little bits of the cream filling missing. Like there, for instance, where it looks like the cream filling is thinner. Also, I know I'm going to paint back over these lines. So I'm not worried about the shadow just yet. I'm painting everything in with this light yellow. And look how bold his brush strokes are and how painterly. I mean, you can really see the strokes, so don't be shy here. The main goal is to cover this blue. Which, of course, we're going to go put back some blue in for the shadow. But we're building layers. And I'm just going to cover this because it's not covering as I want. And actually, since I did that, let's try this. Since it's still wet, I'm going to take this brush and see if I can pull off some of that paint and draw those lines right back in. And that's good enough for now. But do you see how much more character this side has? This is really more perfect. More perfect. It's not perfect, but it's more perfect. But this is more interesting, in my opinion. So I'm going to pull out some of my Ultramarine Blue. I'm going to mix a touch of retarder in with it and in with the Cerulean, because we didn't do that earlier. So again, this is just slows the paint drying time. Leaves it open so that we can play with it a little bit longer. So here's where things kind of get interesting color-wise. I'm going to play with my blues and white. And I'm going to mix my two blues with a little white on the brush and start painting this shadow in. Now, if you used a lot of yellow on this side, you might want to wait for it to dry because it's going to turn green. So he did all kinds of brush strokes, some vertical, some horizontal, mostly horizontal. And the right brush for the right job. So that little brush wasn't crisp enough on these edges, so using this flat brush. Oh yeah. And then remember, this shadow comes all the way to the end of that triangle. So I'm actually going to start at the bottom here so I can measure it well. So I think I did my shadow longer than his. I'm not going to worry about it. Now as I do this, since the white paint is still wet, I'm picking up white as I go. And I don't necessarily want that on there, so I'm just going to wipe that off and go back, reload my brush. All right, so painting is all about making adjustments, going back and forth and fixing things that you want to change. And I don't like how wide this bottom shadow is. So I'm just going to add a little white in there. And I will have to wait for that to dry to get more white in there. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to make the shadow a little smaller. Okay, now the entire cake is painted in. So you can pause now if you're still working on painting the cake. I'm moving on to the next step. Okay, so the next step is going to be getting the values right. So you can see on this painting how light it is right in here where the sun is hitting it. And I don't know if you can see how wonderfully brushstrokey scratchy. You've got these spots of white, some yellow, some orangish there. Have fun with this. And if you need a smaller brush for this, grab a smaller brush. And then the top of the cake has all these squigglies in it. So for that, I'm actually going to use a round brush. Use what you've got. I would say use a small brush for this. And take some white, maybe go along the edge there. Do some strokes, just some loose, fun, whimsical brush strokes. And if you can see some blue through, go ahead and cover that up now. Ah, it's looking better, looking better, looking better. Now on this side, on that shady side, it's really sort of, we've got sort of a bright orangey color and then some very muddy things happening here and this dark mark. So let's see what happens. I'm going to mix this Naples and Magenta, adding a little more Naples in there, a little more of that yellow to get this bright line. Goes along the bottom and up along the side. And it's also right on the edge there. So I'm just going back and forth between Naples, Magenta, getting a really sort of sloppy, painterly look. I'm actually going to mix a little magenta and ultramarine. Which makes a nice purple, but it reads almost, at least in person, it reads almost like a black. Smudge, oh yeah. Smudge some of that in. And if you get too much on your brush, just wipe off your brush on your towel and go right back to it. It's a nice shadow. And then it's the darkest value. It's right here, at least on the cake. Or on the side of the cake, I should say. And then it does have this dark line all around it. So you could either use a mix of purple like I'm doing. You could even use black if you wanted to. But make sure you're painting very thinly. So light pressure, not a lot of paint on the brush. Oh, that line added a lot to that painting. All right. That's something I didn't do over here. Okay, so where else do we see that dark value? Since we have it on our brushes, right along the bottom of the cake there. And the bottom here. Now I'm using a round brush, but use whatever small brush you're comfortable with. Whatever makes thin lines the best for you. Some here. I'm going to thicken up that edge a little bit by bringing the line a little bit further to the right. And there's some dark spots in the corners here. Ah, coming along, coming along. We're going to leave that for the moment and move on to the next step. Good place to pause if you're not caught up. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put another layer of white around the edge of this cake, around the base. Because this cake is going to be in higher contrast. Because this white is a much lighter value than the yellow. So I'm going to crisp it up while I'm doing it. And I need some more white. I'm actually not going to put any retarder in with this white because I don't really need it to stay wet. Now, even though I'm doing a second layer, I still want a little bit of that blue, not necessarily to show through, but it's creating a whole vibe, for lack of a better word. You can't necessarily see it, but it's sort of cooling off that white. Ah, yes. See, it's really starting to come together. Now this is the point before you do this, go around this shadow, you might want to check your shape against the original. And if you decide to, you can still change it after you paint it in. You can always paint more blue in if you need. If you need to, nothing's ever lost. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to put this little thing on top. Is that a cherry? I don't know what that is, but I'm using my magenta and a round brush. I'm rolling the brush through the paint to get a point on there. And I'm going just a little bit up. It almost actually sits on top of the horizon line there. And I'm just doing a little circle. A little circle. And then I'm just going to wipe my brush off, not going to wash it. I'm just going to grab some of my dark blue, which is my ultramarine. And I'm just doing some little brush strokes going from the bottom of the circle about halfway up. Use your smallest brush to do this. And some areas it goes around a little further than halfway. And not bad, not bad. And while that dries, I'm going to go back in and add these layers back in. So I'm using my small brush again, some yellow, some magenta. More yellow. I want it brighter. And if you press too hard, you're going to get a lot of cream filling in there. Now the layers on the right side have more magenta than yellow because they are in the shade. And as a matter of fact, let me just do a little more magenta here and here. And we can go back around. And add a thicker, make it look like the frosting on top is a little bit thicker just by making that line on the top of the slice a little thicker. And since this is in the light, I added a little bit of white to that yellow to brighten it up right here. And notice I'm not making just a straight line. I'm doing little dabs of paint. Little short brush strokes. And now I'm going to move back to that shadow of the little topping. And I'm mixing my cerulean and my ultramarine for that. And I'm just doing this little skinny shadow on the left-hand side. Yeah, that works. If you want to, you can be done at this point if you want. But if you want to get some texture in that shadow and some little orange and yellow light around there, and he even used, it looks like maybe an aqua color on the edges You can do all of that. Have fun with it. I'm going to use some ultramarine, then maybe some cerulean. See why he may have done that. Why did he make these sketchy sort of shadows here? And really, on this last step, he didn't do this up here, but I kind of like it. You can get a bit whimsical. Do some light brush strokes. Don't get, well, get carried away if you feel like getting carried away. But my motto is if you love your painting, or if you like it 75%, leave it alone. Unless your goal is to just explore the medium, then go for it. Have fun. Knock yourself out. Put some whimsical lines everywhere. It's your painting. You can do what you want. I'm just going to pull out a little aqua for the fun of it. And actually, I could clean up my cake pieces here and make that shadow a little stronger. Make that contrast between shadow and light even stronger. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of this aqua on the edge here for fun. Make sure you have a clean brush when you do that, if you do that. And I think that's it. I feel complete. So before you finish, you know, and you can do this at any point in the painting, it's actually a great idea to do this, is to prop your painting up someplace against a wall or something and stand back 6 to 8 feet and get some perspective on it. And see what is working. See what you like. Ask yourself, what do I like best about this painting? And sometimes you'll do that and you'll say, oh, yeah, I think it's finished. And sometimes you'll say, oh yeah, I know what I need to do. And sometimes you still won't know, and that's okay, and it'll just take a little while longer to figure it out. And sometimes you just have to put it on the wall and live with your painting for a while to decide whether it's done or not. And I gotta tell you, it is really hard to stop working on a painting. Oh, one last step is this line, which, what did I do? I think I mixed some ultramarine and white to get that line. It almost comes up as like a light purple. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this class. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to post in the comments below and to post your finished painting. I would love to see it. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.